So please welcome Steve Marshall, Attorney General of Alabama.
Good morning. Y'all been invaded by Alabama. Let me make that clear. Ain't no hurricane gonna keep us away. Now, it's so good to be with you today, and actually they've given me a little bit more time. So I may sort of take us out a little bit, big picture for a second, and then dive into ways that we are attempting to protect women and girls in this country. Let me assure you that Bob Ferguson and Rob Bonta and Tish James are not breaking bread at the Marshall household. In fact, I think they would probably be throwing darts right now if they knew they were even being described. But grateful for Tim for sharing that. Love ADF. And as you know, we're with you. And so thank you for that fight. And I love the theme of the conference. I mean, drawing upon Esther, you were born for such a time as this. Y'all know something's happening in about 38 days, right? I mean, we get it. And I also appreciate the work that was done and the materials you were given about the platforms, the promises of the respective parties, and particularly the candidates, because y'all, the reality is that we are at that leverage point in our country where we have to make that choice. And uniquely over the course of the next 3 days, you're going to have an opportunity to truly hear what those choices look like. One of limited government versus one that sort of will echo those horrific words that I'm the federal government, I'm here to help. That we believe that life is precious beginning in the womb versus those that believe that choice should include taking the innocent life of unborn children. We have that choice between a secure nation that believes in a secure border versus those that think that our immigration laws are simply illusory. Or maybe what I'm going to dive into a little bit about today is whether or not we are a nation that believes that our gender is defined at conception, or whether or not we embrace this idea that our gender is not biological, but instead is a state of mind. Now, the reality is, y'all, elections have consequences. And we see that over and over again with an administration that's not grounded in sound policy and clearly not in the principles of our founders. In fact, they've abandoned those very things that have made us the envy of the world. But yet, I'm here to tell you that despite all of that, I think there's good news. And the good news is reflected in the spirit of the people that are in this room, and more importantly, by those that we know in this nation that came before you. Because although we sometimes want to think we've never been here before, well, we have. I mean, look, just go back to 1980, right? I mean, think about the similarities where we were then and where we are now. We had runaway inflation. We had world powers that didn't respect our country and our strength. And we had a president who was rudderless that was running for re-election. Does that sound familiar? Right? It does, doesn't it? And we yet had a candidate, Ronald Reagan, who expressed this sense of optimism, a vision of strength and power for an America, and this country embraced that. Believe that that's truly who we are, and through that election, we're able to change the course of our country for many years. And what I think is truly in our DNA, and I think it's deep in our core, because it goes back to a nation now almost 250 years old, is that we embrace this idea that we don't work for a country to simply allow our lives to be better, but instead we are attempting to build a country that allows our children and our grandchildren and generations to come to have better lives than we had before us. Uniquely, I had a chance to go to the American Cemetery in Normandy earlier this summer, one of the most sobering experiences in my life. And as I looked at the thousands of white crosses of young American men who died in a foreign land, I was struck by the decision they had to make. Probably seeing and hearing the story of the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941 and realizing that they had to step up. That by signing their name to serve this country, they understood that not only were they risking their own personal safety, but also potentially the safety of others in their family, the security of knowing that that person would be there. But yet they believed in that bigger mission. to be able to strike back against tyranny and oppression and to make sure that our country was safe and secure. And they were willing to do that even though they risked their lives in doing so. Y'all, this election needs to reflect that same spirit. And I know it is what is encompassed in this room, and it's one of the things that I think Eagle Forum remains one of the most powerful opportunities to influence issues in our respective states. And I have no doubt that it's that spirit of your great founder that allowed her to engage the conscience of this nation. You know, it is a true honor to be with you in the centennial of an amazing life, of a woman who had a remarkable legacy. And I would tell you, though, and I've never had a chance to meet her, I think if she was here today, she'd have to admit that she called it, right? That she got it right. That decades ago, she saw exactly where things were headed, particularly for women. And she stirred up a vigilance among conservatives for the fights ahead. The only thing that I think would have surprised her is the pace in which things were about to change. Because even just 10 years ago, when we have thought that we were dealing with some of the radical concepts that we are dealing with today, I mean, how many of you had ever heard this term, preferred pronouns, let alone seen it on somebody's business card when they handed you? And I'm convinced that there are still many Americans that have yet to come face to face with a stark reality that this gender ideology presents. Again, it's why I think this organization remains such a vital role in the public discourse, because the fight that we're having over Title IX that I'll talk to you about, but other areas involving women and children, go back to that historic battle that this organization had with the Equal Rights Amendment. So can I start there? Are y'all good with that? Because recently, I don't know if you know this, I think it was this week, we had a United States Senator from Maryland get on the floor of the United States Senate and say that he believed that the ERA was a part of the Constitution. Well, I got some words for him. He's wrong. And let me tell you why he's wrong. Because, you know, when I came into office in 2017, one issue I didn't expect to deal with was Equal Rights Amendment, some 40 years after its failed ratification. But when several blue states and their attorneys general tried to revive that effort 40 plus years after its proponents failed, I knew that my state was going to pick up the mantle in honor of Phyllis's great defeat of it in 1979. And I hope we made her proud. Now, again, a little bit of a reminder. That doomed ratification of ERA began in 1979 when the original deadline set by Congress passed without the requisite 38 states voting to approve it. Congress tried to somehow or another call an audible. And a year before it was about to fail, they extended that deadline to 1982, but yet still, they couldn't get sufficient number of states to be able to sign on to that amendment. But at least the left is persistent, I guess. In the 90s, there began to be this effort, the three-state approach. They believed if we can just get 3 more states to be able to ratify that amendment, we can argue that it's a part of the Constitution. They did in 2020, where Virginia became that supposed 38th state. Now, these 3 latecomer states decided to litigate that question about whether or not their adoptions, well after the fact, allowed for the ERA to now magically become ratified. The district court in D.C. dismissed the case entirely, and the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals affirmed that win in February of last year. And y'all, when we as a state in Alabama intervened in that fight, our message was simple. The Equal Rights Amendment furthers equal rights in name only. It would benefit no one whose interest it claimed to advance, either because it absolutely wasn't needed, but more importantly, because real women were no longer the target beneficiaries. And what I found interesting was that our win in that case got very little fanfare. That's maybe because President Trump was our president in December of 2019. Nobody was particularly worried about this seemingly random, far-fetched revival of the ERA. But we had an instinct, thanks to this organization and our friends at Alliance Defending Freedom, that this was more than simply about women. This was about the left reviving something that was artfully named and for some would seem like a good thing, but would be nothing more than a Trojan horse for the transgender movement. And can you imagine if right now we had a constitutional amendment on the books that activist judges could use to promote the transgender cause. Lord have mercy. We'd be struggling, because if that happened, if just Alabama and only a few red states joined us in this case and faced vehement criticism when we did so, I don't think we would have been as successful in the other wins I'm going to tell you about today. And one thing that I'm absolutely confident about is that when the proponents of the ERA advocated for its passing, no one, whether you were for it, and definitely if you were against it, disagreed that sex was established and cemented at the time of conception. All right, let's move into now what is more of the modern day fight. We know that we have a nation led by an administration in Washington, and now we have at least one member of the United States Supreme Court who cannot definitively answer a simple question. You know what that is? What is a woman? I can, you can, they can't. This administration, the radical left's rejection of this biological certainty, isn't just philosophical, because within 100 days of taking office, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris unveiled Executive Order 1388. And it was designed to, quote, prevent and combat discrimination on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation. And veiled in faulty legal analysis, this directive set the federal government on a crusade to achieve a gender-free American society, including employment, housing, healthcare, and education, the practical effect which would have been decidedly bad for women and girls. Now, they started with a free lunch program. The USDA tried to hijack the free school lunch program to force gender ideology into every public school in America. In May of 2022, the USDA announced the program's prohibition on sex discrimination that would now extend to discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity. And while the announcement was coupled with no examples of schools denying access to free lunches for any children, regardless of their persuasion, the Secretary of Agriculture explained that LGBTQ plus students needed to be provided with an avenue to grieve discrimination they face. In other words, a male student identifying as a female could end his school free lunch program if he was denied access to a girl's restroom. And where was the outrage on the left? They were attempting to use a program to feed hungry children to advance this radical agenda. Unfortunately, they were not successful. We believe this effort was wrong, and our states joined with several others to challenge the lawlessness of this change. Ultimately, the USDA settled that case and agreed not to enforce that provision against the plaintiff states. But they weren't done. Then the administration announced that the WIC program, which remember means women, infants, and children, must also comply with new expansive meaning of sex. States, all that administer this program on behalf of the USDA program, were asked to confirm that they had adopted policy to support the needs of pregnant and breastfeeding/chest feeding parents. Now, yeah, you heard me right. Chest feeding parents with diverse gender identities, including updated bathroom signage to be more inclusive of all gender identities, as well as counseling tailored to individuals to be more inclusive of gender identities. Yet again, legal challenges are ongoing to make sure that this nonsense isn't implemented. They went further. The administration then enlisted their hand-picked Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to support their cause. In October of last year, the EEOC issued a new Title VII guidance informing America's employers that it would now be considered sexual harassment to intentionally refer to an employee by the wrong name or pronoun or deny access to bathrooms or other sex-segregated facilities consistent with an employee's gender identity. Now, aside from exposing companies to limitless liability, this guidance failed to consider how the proposal would damage employee morale and productivity or acknowledge the extreme psychological toll on this experiment would have on women in the workplace. Now, we filed that lawsuit in July alongside 17 other states to stop this misguided policy from going into effect, and right now we're waiting on the court to rule. Now, admittedly, any day I can sue Joe Biden is a good day, but especially especially when it relates to protecting kids. And y'all, this issue, maybe more than anything else, is why I am so grateful for this organization, because Alabama was one of the first states to say, we're going to protect our kids from radical gender ideology. And when we passed a law prohibiting devastating sex change treatments and surgeries for kids, Merrick Garland's DOJ came to town to challenge our law. A law now adopted in over 20 states, which, by the way, has its origin and vigorous support from this organization. The good thing I can tell you, and although I couldn't have told you this a year and a half ago, today we're winning. Not only in Alabama, did we have a district court impose sanctions against groups that tried to serve an unlawful subpoena on Eagle Forum to intimidate them from their advocacy. The information that we have uncovered in discovery has delivered a huge blow in the credibility to the other side. Evidence we expose shows a conspiracy between top Biden administration officials, liberal academics, outside advocacy groups and their litigating attorneys, and woke medical organizations to manufacture a false expert consensus to push experimental and failed treatment for children who suffer from gender dysphoria. Now, one of the ringleaders of that group is Admiral Rachel Levine. Now, this is where we boo, right? Anybody seen that picture? Y'all in Alabama, I ask them to put my picture up to him all the time because it makes me more popular every day. Remember the story about him? He was born Richard Levine, married and had kids, talked about what a wonderful blessing it was to have had the opportunity to have children, but he later identified as a transgender woman. After Biden's DOJ challenged Alabama's law protecting kids, we fought for and got access to not only HHS's records, where he serves in a high position, but also the World Organization Advancing Transgender Health Issues, WPATH. And one of the things that we found is that Admiral Levine, on behalf of the Biden administration, directly lobbied WPATH to remove age restrictions on life-altering surgeries for kids. Imagine that we wanted and have an administration that says we don't need to have an age limit on non-reversible surgeries on kids. Y'all, is there anything else I can tell you about the insanity of this administration's position? And while that litigation remains ongoing, and with an absolutely vital United States Supreme Court case that will be heard later this year, we have shifted the narrative on this issue nationally. And the support of Eagle Forum has been invaluable in educating the public on the catastrophic effect of these medical interventions. Most importantly, children across our country have been saved from these life-altering treatments. All right, let's move now into the current battle. It involves Title IX. Y'all, the last time I gave a talk about Title IX, it was in a town hall in Alabama where the protesters showed up, and I had one of them holding up a whiteboard that said liar, and as we was standing up, I turned around and he had a tail on the back. So I'm a little bit more friendly group here today as we talk about it. All right, little background on what's going on here. Our United States Department of Education, that's another thing to boo, by the way, through changes in rules relating to Title IX, are trying to import gender ideology into our schools and colleges by redefining sex, expanding the definition of harassment to cover people who don't embrace Biden's gender ideology, and then making it easier for institutions and schools to punish students for not towing the line. Now, a little background, because it's interesting. Title IX came about somewhat around the discussion of the Equal Rights Amendment. There, the proponents of the bill had a noble cause. Let's make sure that we allow women to access educational opportunities and programs the same as men. Bipartisan support made sense, and y'all, it has been remarkably successful. Within 30 years, for example, just one statistic, female participation in sports rose from 1 in 27 to 1 in 3. I'd say that's good, right? Something that we ought to embrace. This was truly a law that allowed additional rights and privileges to be given to women that they should have had before. Now, here's the operative language of that bill. It says, no person in the U.S. shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subject to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. And y'all, when that bill was enacted in 1972, no one doubted that the use of the term sex in that statute meant biological sex. And I can guarantee you that no congressman who voted on that bill believed that voting for that provision would allow boys to be able to access girls' locker rooms or for boys to play against sports against women. Now, this longstanding view of Title IX totaled almost 4 decades, and it changed, no shocker, during the Obama administration, and not by a modification of law, but instead through agency action and interpretation. Now, it's not as if the activists didn't try. In fact, there was aggressive lobbying efforts that went on beginning with the Obama administration to convince Congress to change the language to do exactly what it is that they wanted to do, to expand that definition of sex. Congress, over and over again, when confronted with the issue, rejected making that change. And it sounds like, to me, the legislative process worked, right? But that wasn't enough for this administration. That when Congress refused to act, President Obama directed his Department of Education to send out a guidance document in 2014 that now newly claimed the Title IX discrimination prohibition extends to discrimination based upon gender identity, and then later sent out another letter to all educational institutions that receive federal funding that the Department of Education would then treat a student's gender identity as that student's sex for purposes of Title IX. For the first time in Title IX's history, schools were being instructed that any attempt to restrict shower, bathroom, or locker room use according to biological sex would be unlawful. The letter further warned that the failure to use pronouns and names consistent with a student's gender identity would constitute unlawful harassment of Title IX. Now, 13 states sued, including Alabama, and the court agreed that that guidance was unlawful, that the administration had gone too far. And you would have thought, based on that court victory, absent a change by Congress in the operative language, that the issue would have been settled. But yet, wasn't true. Now, the good thing is that the issue sat dormant during the Trump administration. In fact, his administration, through the Department of Education, issued a common sense regulation in the May of 2020 that maintained the longstanding rejection of gender identity as qualifying under Title IX. The left, including some of the attorneys general you heard about earlier, attempted to vacate that regulation, and the courts rejected it. And why? Because the Trump administration was true to the operative language of that statute. You would imagine that when President Biden came into office, I almost could imagine him standing next to President Obama, and they talked about this issue, and he simply said, "Hold my beer, because here I go." Because it started from day one. Day one, they issued an executive order that told every federal department that sex includes discrimination based on gender identity and sexual orientation, and they need to get after and do something about it. We saw shortly after that, in June of 2021, his Department of Education issued what they referred to as a Dear Educator letter, attempting to interject gender identity as qualifying for Title IX protection. That letter, again, was quickly challenged by the states, including Alabama, and we prevailed, but the fight wasn't over. Later, the Biden-Harris administration announced a proposed comprehensive regulatory rewrite of Title IX. This project memorialized the language in that prior decree that would have prohibited sex discrimination, including sexual orientation and gender identity. They would have redefined sex-based harassment to cover students' use of pronouns and names consistent with gender identity, and eliminated due process safeguards for those accused of discrimination. The rule would have prohibited schools from obtaining documentation to validate that student's gender identity, and could encompass and make liable views critical of gender identity expressed outside of educational programs. And they wanted to do that despite this little document we call the Constitution, with a kind of important provision called the First Amendment. Far beyond anything that we've ever seen before. In essence, Every K through 12 public school in the country was about to become gender-free by the start of the 2024 school year if federal funding was going to continue. And while conspicuously mum on the issue of sports, the administration's policy mandated absurdities ranging from boys and girls restrooms and locker rooms and showers to boys and girls hotel rooms on overnight school trips. Now, any proposed regulation has to receive comments before it can be adopted. And in this case, over 240,000 comments were received. The vast majority were against it. Didn't dissuade this administration. Instead, in April of this year, they announced that effective August 1, this new rule would be effective. The Biden administration efforts would transcend more than simply those activities at educational institutions. In fact, one consequence of this new regulation would be to superintend and supersede any state law that was in conflict with its provisions. For example, in Alabama, we passed a common sense statute that boys will play against boys and girls will play against girls. We'd made clear that the door to a woman's locker room would stay closed to biological males despite their claims of gender identity. And yes. It became then the responsibility of people like me to be able to stand up for our state's sovereignty and to be able to defend these common sense provisions. And I'll explain to you a little bit about that litigation effort. But y'all, we're right on this issue. I mean, not only do we understand in this room that we're right, but the majority of Americans believe we're right as well. If you look at poll after poll, for example, nearly 70% of Americans say transgender athletes should only be able to compete on sports teams that confirm with their birth identity. The same percentage holds true with access to bathrooms. Yet another national poll, when specifically looking at the impact of this regulation, almost 70% of Americans there strongly disagreed with what the Biden administration was doing. And in fact, the president, I guess maybe now I should say Kamala, is losing with their own supporters. 2/3 of black voters, independents, and voters in open seats, plus a majority of women, urban voters, and voters with a Democratic incumbent object. Even 1/3 of Democrats who were 2020 Biden voters opposed this change. And while the talking heads may say differently, not only do we know firmly that we're right, legally, morally on this issue, but America agrees with us. So what are we doing to stop it? To date, 26 states have sued this administration to strike down this rule. In Alabama, we filed suit in Birmingham, along with Georgia, Florida, and South Carolina. And just a few weeks ago, we won a huge victory in the 11th Circuit, confirming that this rule couldn't go into effect. 6 other federal courts have struck down that rule, meaning now that every state that's challenged it has won. In fact, the Department of Justice went to the United States Supreme Court trying to seek relief. Supreme Court disagreed and said that we're supporting the district courts that right now have said the law can't go into effect. We won. The good thing also is that in it we've had the help of many of our nonprofits. 3 of those, Young Americans Foundation, Female Athletes United, and Moms for Liberty, also sued. And a Kansas judge ruled that not only in those states in which there are orders, but also for these 3 nonprofits where you have chapters, likewise the rule at those institutions can't go into effect, covering thousands of schools, universities, and institutions across our country, even in blue states. Y'all, don't you know it kept Gavin Newsom up at night, right? And that's a huge win. Lots going on in this space. And maybe a little bit following Tim, you can kind of get a theme about how these battles emerge. You know, I'm a longtime prosecutor. I don't mind getting a little bloody. In fact, I enjoy a good fight. And uniquely, Alabama gives me the opportunity to be able to do that. It's why I'm so grateful. But I'm not doing it alone. You're going to hear from Andrew Bailey here in a little bit. Here in Missouri, he's one of our new young guns coming along. But Republican attorney generals across the country have been effective in pushing back against administration. Even the Wall Street Journal just last week acknowledged that much of the Biden administration's policy effort has been thwarted in the courts by AGs, and I can tell you that we're not going to stop. We thank you. We like to call ourselves America's last line of defense. That name kind of emerged when AGs first followed Obamacare back in 2011, and it's one that I reflect on a lot. When I consider the weightiness of serving as your last line of defense, two illustrations from military history come to mind. One, the Roman army. It's one of the most powerful and masterful armies the world has ever seen. Its legions were the backbone of an expansive Roman Empire. And in Roman warfare, the triarii were the legion's last line of defense. They were the veteran soldiers with the very best equipment, and they were the last available line. If the triarii were called upon, it was a sign that the decisive moment of battle had come. In World War II, the Rhine River was known as Germany's last line of defense against invasion from the West. To finish off the Nazis, the Allied troops needed to cross the Rhine and secure German lands on the other side. But no invading army had been able to do it since Napoleon in 1805. But yet, on a cold night in March of 1945, General Patton gathered his men and quietly made his way across, eventually capturing over 19,000 demoralized German troops and initiating the Allies' march into central Germany. The last line having fallen, Germany surrendered a few weeks later. And there have been key moments over my now almost 8 years of Attorney General where I've had to ask myself what kind of Attorney General I wanted to be. One that could be counted on for strength in a decisive moment of battle, or one that would be quietly defeated at the height of conflict. I can tell you that I am surrounded by some courageous and like-minded attorneys general from across the country, and I'm proud to say that we have held that line, especially, I think, for women and girls. And y'all, we ain't going anywhere. And I expect Eagle Forum will standing right there beside us. Now, since the idea of this great nation was birthed, principled Americans have always stepped up. From a cool morning in Lexington, Massachusetts in 1775 to a warm, cloudless September day in 2001, we know that generations of Americans have answered when duty called, and the existence of our nation was at stake. We owe a huge debt of gratitude to those who came before us, people like Phyllis, who, because of their struggle, their fearlessness, and their tenacity, handed us the keys to the greatest country on earth. And now we get a chance to be engaged and involved to help others make decisions to pass on that same greatness to our children and the generations to come. And if we, as countless Americans have before us, choose that path of freedom and opportunity, I have no doubt that America's greatest days are yet to come. Thank you for what you do in your respective states. I'm proud of my folks from Alabama, and I know at AGs in your states are proud of you as well. Thank you, and may God bless you all.